Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm extremely pleased and excited to be here with Damien Walter. And this is part two of his proposal about Star Trek as the appropriate mythos for our time. And so I'm just going to turn things over to Damien. He'll take us through a bit of review. Last time we did a lot of good work to get to a clear presentation of his thesis in full, and he's going to just quickly take us to that, and then we will unpack that thesis and explore it and constructively critique it and all the wonderful things we're supposed to do. So welcome, Damien. It's great to have you here again.
Thank you very much for having me back for part two of this, John, which I wasn't expecting it to take me this long to prove that Star Trek is the story that we need for our times. And actually, from the last conversation, I think it inspired a new video essay that I'm working on for my YouTube channel.
Excellent.
About the postmodern destruction of Star Trek. Because one of the things I've observed I spend a lot of time in kind of the YouTube critique sphere, and there are a lot of people who are very angry about Star Trek at the moment and the new seasons of it. And I feel like they're making a kind of error because they're identifying some of these real issues and then basically they're blaming it on that demon of wokeness. So I'm trying to actually to show that it's more the postmodern era than postmodern people who are the problem for
that's
where Star Trek is at the moment. And I think our conversation last time inspired some of that thinking in me, because we strayed into these area of the culture wars, and maybe I can take us back to that point to kind of just hit some of those key points. So I think we started with the thinking about, and I went into some detail about my kind of history that built up to my first course, The Rhetoric of Story, to think about story as a psychotechnology.
Yes.
In your terminology there, so that we found this way to kind of mirror the way the human mind, the psyche works in the presentation of whatever media they are. And we thought about cave paintings initially, and then we go all the way through the great theatrical traditions and cinema and video games today. This psychotechnology that allows us to be immersed into like a human experience.
Right.
And with that, we're able to take early humans and give ourselves the identity of the hunter. I'm sure humans were hunting, but we are able to attach values to that activity. So we tell the story of the hunter and we make them heroic, and we emphasize their value to the tribe. And here we've created this identity, this persona. And I think this is what we're doing with the psychotechnology of story. We're creating our characters as people.
Yes.
Because I mean, it's crazy, really, what all the different things we're capable of doing. And I feel this is all bound up with our storytelling. And we do this for thousands of years. And it's this process of telling stories and then our new identities feeding back into the story that gives us what I'm using the term mythos for.
Yeah.
So I tried to make it clear that I'm absolutely not a classic scholar by any means. So in many ways, I'm very ignorant of the usage of the word mythos in Greek society. But I think it's useful for us today because we now have this hyper-saturated culture of storytelling. So there's stories absolutely surrounding us wherever we are, day in, day out. We're saturated in the media. It's all storytelling. And we need a way of talking about this. And I think that is the mythos.
Yes.
It's really useful for us today because of the powerful impact that the mythos is having on our lives, that we're more immersed in it than ever before. And we have conflicts from within the mythos, which I think is where we got to that culture war point, because we have, I think, a number of different stories competing for our perception of what is real. which is one of the things the mythos subconsciously defines for us. So we have these kind of the ancient, the pre-modern stories are great religious narratives, and those are still powerful for many, many people, but it's questionable how far we can really believe in those in the way that a human being 1,000 years ago might have been able to believe in the Christian mythos, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have the modern mythos, which has been a long time displacing the mythos of science and technology and Star Trek. And that's, still dominant in our society today, and it still has its old conflicts, even though it's won most of them. So the atheist is still very angry about God, this older part of the mythos. But the modern mythos is completely dominant, really, in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But now there is this challenger, the postmodern mythos, which I talked about as being more narrative aware. So the postmodern mythos is very active, rewriting myths like Star Trek, for instance. So I think we have this conflict within the mythos of our society between these three great stories, one old, one dominant, one emergent. And I think that we kind of started to get into the point of how Star Trek can bridge those three between. Do you think I hit most of the points there?
That was very good. So I want to bring up 2 points, and then I'll return things. One is, you talk about how within any mythos, there's inevitably conflict between the narratives. And then, of course, what people used to do was advert, they would defer to some kind of meta-narrative. Like a nomological, this is the structure of reality, a nomological or a normative, this is how we get better as people, and right. And then, of course, famously, Lyotard argued that postmodernism is defined by the claim that there are no meta-narratives, which is, of course, a weird meta-narrative claim, but we'll just put that problem aside for a sec, what the status of that actual claim is. So I'm wondering if postmodernism is because of its challenging of a meta narrative, it's challenging a space to which we can defer, or from which we can draw authority in order to manage the conflict between our narratives, which would also be the space in which we would be having this discussion to some degree, because you're making a proposal about how Star Trek can actually mediate between the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern. And then the second is, I'm in regular discussion with many people in many different groups, but they sort of are converging, and perhaps there's consilience around a claim of metamodernism as a thing distinct from postmodernism. And while I wouldn't directly call myself a metamodernist, I find a lot of sympathy with the proposals that are being made there. So those are sort of two things I wanted to just sort of bounce off you. One is, are we, and I'm happy to challenge the postmodern claim that there can be no meta narratives. Is that being challenged here? Because it is, and again, there are no definitions, but this is supposed to be a defining feature. I know that there's all kinds of self-erasing language here in postmodernism, which makes it very difficult to wrestle with. But are we doing that? Are we saying that there's a space in which we can do that? Is that the space in which we can see how Star Trek can bridge between the three? And then what about the metamodern? Is Star Trek also capable of appealing to this? Because this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll return things back to you. The metamodern claims to be doing exactly what you propose. It claims to find the through line between the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern, and a way forward. So we're not in the perpetual aporia of postmodernism. So I know that was a bit of a ramble, but I hope that gives you like a couple of things to play with.
I'm increasingly using the word metamodern to describe, to frame my thinking in story, narrative, and more broadly as well. But there's at least two strands of metamodernism. One is the aesthetic, which I think is actually a kind of rebrand of postmodernism, that it is like postmodern irony with a bit more sincerity attached. So there was a very big essay from Thomas Flight, who is a really big YouTube film reviewer, and he had obviously found this term metamodernism and interviewed Greg Dember, who is on the aesthetic side of metamodernism. And Thomas did this big essay, and I did a response video to that, and we've since done an interview about it. Because I'm very much over on this other side of metamodernism, which I think has come out of, and I'd be interested to know what you think of these areas, developmental psychology, developmental theory, stage theory, and the kind of the popular fronts of those, spiral dynamics and integral theory, which are, to not go into detail about them, they are an argument for the need to integrate different stages of our psychological persona, of our civilizational as well. And I have a feeling that these are very bound up with the stories that we tell, that if they're the problem for stage three is where is this happening?
Yes.
You know, we haven't changed as beings, and there is a whole area of this that is around Daniel Gort's Hansi Freinacht, the metamodern philosopher, which is about, you know, cognitive development.
Yes.
Is, you know, I don't deeply understand the that side of metamodernism. I've only looked at it briefly, but I find that questionable, that we're actually questioning the cognitive levels, let's say, of people with traditional religious beliefs, for instance. And that doesn't seem at all to integrate. That seems to only exacerbate our cultural. So the cognitive developmental model of metamodernism, I think, is really just inflaming our cultural conflicts together, and it's doing the opposite of integrating these different parts of our culture and civilization. But I feel that what does evolve is our stories and our storytelling, is our mythos. Actually. And I think, I mean, I'm never going to be the person to study this in detail. I'm a storyteller, so I just throw the ideas out there. But, with what I know about stage development theory, you have these distinct stages emergent, because for the continued growth of a system or an organism, you have to abandon the previous stage and you have to make a distinct change from it. So we have to do this in our culture, for instance. Moving into the scientific era, you have to let go of your religious myths. They can't be allowed to continue to interfere in what you need to do to make that developmental leap. You still need them. They were still there. They're in the same way you still need you still need the learning that you had when you were 6, when you get to 12.
You still need your tongue to eat, even though you use it for speech.
Of course. Yeah, an exaptation.
Yes.
And that, I think, is the key insight of these different areas of developmental theory, developmental psychology, that we have to make the transition, but we still have to value what was there before and integrate it.
Yes.
And this is the really difficult thing, I think, for people to grasp in our culture war situation. This is the fundamental error that we're making, is we can't abandon our religious past. We still need it, but our modernist narrative wants to get rid of it. Our postmodernist narrative, the elements that are key to it are a continued attack on like capitalist systems and the idea that we can simply abandon those in the past. So it's this conflicted need to both move on from the past, but to still honor it and keep it as part of
Exactly,
of where.
exactly. I try to capture that with my phrase, neither nostalgia nor utopia.
Yeah.
So that's exactly that. So do you think that the metamodern framework, and I agree with you, I think metamodernism makes sense at the level of the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, the level at with mythos is evolving the relevance realization of collective intelligence, the way Brett Anderson is arguing in some of his recent essays based on my work and Jordan Peterson's work. And so I think that's right. I think mythos is how the we does grows its relevance realization capacities so that it can grok hyper objects and exercise a kind of hyper agency in the world. So do you think that means that in a sense we're getting back a space of meta-narrative? It's not the old kind of space, the space of Descartes or a universal logic space or something like that, but it sounds like there's an attempt both within metamodernism and in your work to find a space where we can do exactly that, right? But the idea is we're not somehow above and free from our historical time and space. Somehow we're still immanent in it, and yet we are trying to recover the past, the tradition, and inventio the future. So I'm sorry, I'm belaboring this because I find it a very interesting proposal. I find that there's this exploration to try and come up with the space that used to be filled with traditional meta-narratives, but with a different kind of meta-narrative. And that I find deeply, deeply intriguing.
Well, I think there's something that I argue is integral to metamodernism, that others may disagree at this point. And it's a fascinating discussion because metamodernism is at the point where we can shape it and what its meaning is.
Yes,
and then it's concrete time.
That's right.
And so it's very useful. And that's the reconstruction of narratives. So in my discussion with Thomas Flight, for instance, actually, that something like Top Gun Maverick is in its way a very metamodern movie because it's saying here's this movie from 40 years ago. That's when Top Gun was now, which you probably loved and you probably watched it with your family, but then it became desperately uncool and everything was postmodern and we didn't want to watch American fighter pilots blowing up the bad guys, and the values of that are just icky.
Yep.
But lots of people still really want that story. And the meta-modern move is to say, okay, we're going to totally honor that desire for this kind of story within our civilization. So the other big narrative of this kind, I think, is Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
There's this scathing attitude towards Lord of the Rings in the more literary world, although even that is dying off actually at the moment, because I think more and more people are making this meta-modern move of saying, well, yeah, it is a story about the return of the king, but maybe we need that story. Maybe that's why it's so powerful.
Right.
Can't simply abandon it. And this is much easier to do with our kind of mythopoeic contemporary reinventions of myth than it is to do with our truly ancient religious myths, which are they're too weighed down with their previous political uses, I guess.
Well, I mean, I would, first of all, that's a great proposal. I think that's really good. Yeah, I think there's the idea that, there's the idea that, well, we've lost some functionality when we threw out this story. And yeah, we can't tell exactly the same story, but we have to recover the functionality that was in that story. And I think I think your thesis that's one of the key moves in metamodernism, I think, is really powerful. I think also the idea that we can do that more in mythos before we can do it in religio or the sacred. But I would hope that the first could educate us so that the second becomes more possible to us. because I think we need a reinventio of the sacred very deeply right now as well, in exactly this kind of way we're talking about. We can't simply return to it, and we can't just sort of propose a utopia in which somehow when we get to the utopia it will disclose itself. Instead, there has to be, you know, the reinventio of it. And the thing that interests me, and I will let you get to your Star Trek thesis very quickly, but I think this is very powerful stuff, because I think it's really
interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really contextualizing what you're doing. Is I'm very interested in the place. Sorry, I'm using that as a metaphor. The place from which that is happening. Like, where are we cognitively, culturally, when we do this reinventio? Like, we're not in the mythos. We're somehow out of it, but we're not. You know, it's like what Maximus says of God. Right, he's in everything but not enclosed. He's beyond everything but not excluded. And like, we're in that weird place. Like, I'm trying to get at, like, it's kind of like you know, the way dreams are sort of about our real lives but not our real lives, and they're in and out. I just find it a very liminal place in a very interesting way. And I'm wondering also, if part of your thesis is let's say that this liminal place is kind of like a pivot point. And you know, and it's almost like an aphoretic aperture that we have to get to, right? Could we not evaluate proposals like yours in terms of exactly their functionality at being able to get us to that pivot point and move things from there, right? So a really good reinventio, a really good modern mythos, or postmodern or non-modern, I don't know what to say now, right, is, well, no, you know what this story does? It gathers the past, it opens up possibilities, and then, but it does it in a way in which it's neither nostalgic nor utopic, and it gives us a place at which we can really reconnect for us, make relevant to us again the power of this in a way that's needed now, here and now. Is that, do you understand what I'm proposing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's this desire, which I see as a non-integrative desire to wake everybody up.
Yes, yeah.
Which I think is probably not. I doubt that any of us are really entirely awake from the mythos that we're immersed in, and most of us, it's simply the reason why we have this all-embracing story is because this is what being human is, and we're all sharing this story. And I mean, I don't know why it's very difficult for people to awake from the story, to put aside your personal identity. I mean, this is part of the meditation experience, but it's something that writers and storytellers need to do.
Right.
At
Okay.
level, I think.
Right.
Because the big challenge, I spent many years teaching creative writing. The big challenge for people who want to write is that really what they want to do is have perpetual immersion into a story they love and have some control over.
Right.
Storytelling is very confused with the immersion into the story. But what you actually need to do, for instance, to become an effective novelist, which I think is one of the highest level kinds of storytelling, or a screenplay writer, is to be able to maintain these states together.
Right.
You need to have some immersion into your imagination and a really well-practiced writing practice, for instance. So I tweeted once that, you know, as I was getting better as a writer, I found it more and more difficult to enjoy stories. And did anybody else share that experience? One of the people I'm friends with is Neil Gaiman, who's a very famous fantasy writer. Yeah. And he tweeted back and just said, yes.
Yeah.
Because you know, your ability to just truly immerse is probably going to be broken by developing this skill. But I think it's those people who then become the people who shape the mythos. And actually, I wanted to put a question to you about Plato, because to lead into basically the topic of how we can deliberately engineer the mythos. Because because again, I'm very inexpert in this area, but there's an academic I've been listening to called Michael Sugru. I think that's the pronunciation.
I don't know the pronunciation either, but yes, go ahead.
So these are kind of like some bits I put together of Plato's life from various sources. So please forgive me if it's completely incorrect.
No worries. Go ahead.
So initially he wants to be a playwright. Mm-hmm. And, that's how he's going to demonstrate his skill, his intellect in the world. And he's stopped from doing this. I picture him crossing the agora. He's going to hand his play in, and Socrates stops him, and basically says, you could be more than a playwright. You could be a philosopher. But Plato always has this fascination with the story, with the mythos of his society. His way of expressing philosophy is the dialogues, the means of a playwright, really.
Yep.
The allegory of the cave is, for me, my interpretation of that is this is the mythos that the people of Athens are immersed in, is the images on the cave wall, because they're being projected by the poets who are the creators, a kind of lower level of creators. And I think Plato has this deep frustration about how can I make the Athenian people better? How can I improve Athens? This is the project of the Republic. And this is Michael Sugru's insight into it, that he knows, he can't have the philosopher kings. He can't have the model of the Republic. He can't make any of this real or happen. So Plato's ultimate idea is the Athenians had this god, this mad, crazy god, Zeus.
Yes, yeah.
And he's going to rewrite that god as Deus, as the god, and take him from a character of the mythos and give him the values of the Logos instead. So he's doing like this immense act of mythos engineering by kind of inventing God. But the important thing is that Zeus now has the values of the Logos, of reason, rationality, and is the creator of the universe. So I don't have to have any belief in God to find that idea fascinating, that an individual, a super intelligent individual, made this intervention into the mythos of their society that has this tremendous historic outcome for thousands of years to come following it.
First of all, I mean, on the specific thesis, I think Plato is trying to use my phrase, trying to steal the culture in the way that's being proposed. And I think he is introducing a kind of non-theism into a polytheistic world. And I think he's carrying the axial revolution into the mythos. The gods before the axial revolution are just powerful or glorious. In the hands of Socrates, you can see it already in Socrates and Plato, and you can't really pull the two of them apart anyways. But in those two, you can see that the gods become sages, they become moral exemplars. And so I agree that thesis is going on. I agree with the thesis that what Plato is doing is exactly that. The way he's doing it, I'm not quite sure. I understand why we're using engineering. Engineering carries with it a sense of a repeatable method that can be applied without much consideration for variation. And that's not what's going on in the Platonic corpus at all, right? Right? There is this endless exploration of, so Plato, at least this is what third way Platonic scholarship argues, and I agree with it. People like Gonzalez and Highland and others, Ruchnik, that what Plato does is he'll constantly, somebody will claim a certain virtue of wisdom, and Socrates will propose techne, right, that procedural technical ability as the paradigm, right? And then people will, oh yes, I want that, and I want wisdom to be a techne, and then he'll draw them out of their opinion by offering them this.
Mm-hmm.
And then he'll sabotage it and show how, but it can't be a techne, right? It can't be something that can be merely engineered. And by the time of the seventh letter, which I do think is authentic, Plato's basically saying, look, you got to live with somebody for a long time, and this spark has to catch. So I agree with the thesis, but I would say to you that, and this is what I've been trying to explore in depth with this whole notion of dialectic into dialogos, right? The way and of course he's drawn on Heraclitus and Parmenides, the Parmenides notion of the one, Heraclitus's notion of the logos. He's bringing them together, but I think the point is, it's not the logos unless it takes shape of its own accord. This is why Socrates says you follow the logos, like he follows the logos the way you follow the wind, and the allusions there, right, to spirituality I think are intended. So I think Plato's doing that, but I think what maybe I'm belaboring it, but what I'm trying to say is the how of that transformation is just as much important as the what of the transformation. Yes, he's not only saying, here's a new God, he's saying, here's a new way to relate to the sacred in a fundamental, transformative way. And he's binding reason, not logic, but reason as logos into the sacred. And as you said, the dialogues are this wonderful combination of drama and argument, and they take on a life of their own, and they're often inconclusive because the point is not to come to a conclusion, etc. So I think that Plato is actually pointing to that point we've been talking about and saying, yes, you won't be able to live in your old myths, but that point gives you a new kind of access to the sacred that can empower many other kinds of mythos to be told. And of course, it shows up in the allegory of the cave. That's my best explanation for why Plato demonstrates this profound ambivalence towards mythos. Like he censors it in the Republic, and yet in the very same book, he engages in it profoundly. And it's like, because I think I think he's making this proposal.
Yeah. He's engaging in an act of myth making.
Yes, and but he's also saying this is a new way to make myth. He's not only saying new myths, he's saying here's a new way to make myths. And I think that is really, and the two I think belong together. I think trying to separate them is a mistake, or prioritize one over the other. They're both. Like the myth of the cave will grab you as a myth if you are living the love of wisdom.
When I'm using the term engineering, I'm trying to indicate there's a purposive intent.
Yes.
Whereas the mythos evolves like fire, or like
that's why I tend to use the verb cultivate, because you cultivate a fire, you cultivate a plant, you have this relationship of tending and attending and affording, but it is directed towards something that you want and encourage to have a life of its own.
What I'm getting to is that, like the gods that had emerged for the Greek pantheon, there wasn't a purposive intent behind them. I think they were simply characters of stories that grew and became more important. And I compare them to like our popular storytelling today. The purpose is to entertain and distract. And Luke Skywalker wasn't invented to play some larger role in society, but for the myth maker, there is some larger role to this storytelling. And they cultivate an awareness of the mythos, and they start feeding back into it. You're right, not in an engineering sense, in something much more organic, in cultivating the mythos, in growing the mythos, more like a gardener.
And
Tolkien is a myth maker of this kind of steeped in all of the myths of European culture. He's been kind of brewing them internally, and they're fusing with his life experiences as well. And then there's also the Inklings, a kind of
Yep. I've read some of them.
philosopher crew of the modern era, and they also engage in their purposive myth making as well. And I think that's what Plato is doing. He's
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that comparison. I think that comparison is very good. I think that's very apt. Especially the open-endedness in some of them. Okay. So given all of that, now
I think another myth maker of that kind is Gene Roddenberry.
Excellent setup. Oh, wow. That's beautiful. Sorry, I just like the aesthetics of that move. That was a beautiful movie. Great segue. Thank you.
Because Roddenberry in the story Bible for Star Trek, he repeats over and over again that this is science fiction, and he has a specific meaning to that at the time. He's using John W. Campbell's definition of science fiction, that it is the telling of a story which extrapolates science into our into our future. And Roddenberry also has some interesting insights into actually the areas of psychology as well, and politics and sociology. And he is wrapping all of these together. And Star Trek is also wagon train. So there's like a history of stories that he's drawing on. And I think in this kind of gardener sense, he grows something very interesting in the early series of Star Trek. So last time we talked about the Silk Road metaphor.
Yes, very much.
And that kind of grows out the fact that it's episodic and it is wagon train in space. So they're going to encounter a new world. And then what's grown from that is the idea that each of these worlds is a kind of a political or a social metaphor, and they're informing the audience and giving us, again, like a psychotechnology to think beyond our one world experience. We only have our own world to look at. In the 60s, it's already becoming globalized. So now we have many other worlds that we can have metaphors for kind of social justice and racial issues, and everything else you can think of. Why civilizations end, that's something Star Trek plays with a lot. And I think that ties into the value of Star Trek, as does this fusing together of the different competing narratives within our mythos today. So maybe I can...
Yeah, please open that up. Yeah.
So William Shatner on a planet fighting a rubber lizard man. It's ridiculous. It's the California countryside, but it's a moment of, tribal heroism.
Yeah.
So Captain Kirk can go from the bridge of the ship and he can be down on a planet fighting for his life in that situation. So that's a whole kind of value system. One of our earliest stories, the lone warrior who's going to go and fight for his people in this mano a mano situation. That's the humorous level there. But then I think if you look at Star Trek, especially Next Generation, and actually I think it's in Next Generation that Star Trek really takes its full form. You have a tremendous sense of order aboard the Enterprise. In fact, it's when they make fun of this in some episodes, like Below Deck, the order is actually really oppressive. The people who just stand all day and stare into a scanner. It's a drama, But it's really comforting for lots of people to watch this tremendously well-ordered world. Everyone has a place. And unless they go into the mirror universe, they're not ambitiously competing for each other's roles.
Yeah.
So it's a truly idealized kind of social order, and it's the military.
Well, it's Plato's Republic is what it is.
Yeah, you could definitely say that about
Picard is the philosopher king, right? And then you have the Guardians, and then you have all the worker, and everybody loves their job and everybody loves their place. It's Plato's Republic in space, basically.
So I think this is tremendously useful for our conservative part of our society, who want this reflected, an ordered world, and that they can return to whenever they want. But crucially, in Star Trek, that conservative social order serves science.
Yes.
And the military serves science, and the exploration of the unknown. And I don't know how deliberate this was from Roddenberry or kind of Rick Berman later on in the Next Generation. But I think this is a really brilliant kind of inversion of where we currently are today with like the military industrial complex. That too often science is serving the military. But you even see that. Yeah, you even see that, like, if you actually look at our military today, the officer corps are all highly educated people, and mostly are scientists as well at some level. So I think that you can kind of see that change happening. But Star Trek is almost a starting point for that, because it starts to shape our ideas of what the military might actually be for. You have NASA at the same time.
Right. That's right. Very good.
So I think that's the first level of integration there. You have this strong social order, the conservative dream there. You're right, Plato's Republic. But in the service of science, knowledge, exploration. And then what do the crew of the Enterprise always prioritize above everything else? The prime directive, non-interference with other people's causes of social justice, essentially. So the values this is all oriented to are the postmodern values of a kind of activist society. So you have the sandwich of the three value levels in Star Trek, which I think is why it's so successful when it's done well, why there's such a broad audience of people who can watch it.
Okay, first of all, this is a brilliant thesis. I really like this thesis. So yeah, you got Plato's Republic that's conservative, but it actually sort of fulfills Plato's greatest longing, which has always been the problem, which is the philosopher kings are ultimately about philosophy and knowledge. They're not about control and power. And so there's that, which of course, as you say, that's the mythos of the Enlightenment, right? Like exploration and gathering knowledge for its own sake. And yet that's in service of non-interference, a kind of multiculturalism, pluralism, social justice framing that's at the core of postmodernism. So I'm just repeating it because I'm savoring it and I'm making sure I'm getting it. Does it sound like I'm understanding it correctly?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's so clear in the show. If you look at it in a kind of this developmental model, it seems to be, and then this sandwich of the different stories within our mythos go and encounter other, often less developed civilizations. And what's the key thing that the Enterprise does? Well, it turns up and saves planets. It couldn't be more clear, in a way, really, that once you have this operational sandwich of our civilization, and they're all working together, you then have the people, the structure, who can turn around and where are we now as a planet in need of saving? We need the Starship Enterprise to come along and turn up and sort out climate change and our geopolitical struggles.
That's very good. Okay, can I ask you something then? Here's one of my critique. I like The Next Generation. I mean, I liked all the Star Treks up until Star Trek Discovery, which to me I thought lost the vision of what Star Trek was. We had enough dark shows. We didn't need to make Star Trek dark. But one of my critiques of The Next Generation is the old series, for all of its flaws, had moments of astonishing awe, and you got a sense of bumping up against the numinous. Think of The City on the Edge of Forever, in which time and the profound mystery of time and how human lives are tragic in the face of time. Like that, like there was that. Or, you know, there's episodes that might not be as good as The City on the Edge of Forever, but there's that episode where they find an individual, Flint, and it turns out he's immortal, and he's been all of these great people. And so there's this sort of silly story about a love triangle going, and then this opens up and you get this tremendous sense like of the numinous again. And one of the, or even like, and their profound ambivalence. One of my favorite scenes is when the Enterprise is battling Apollo, because that's just like the quintus in Who Will Mourn for Adonis. That's just like, my gosh, this is, and the Enterprise is like such a character in that show, right? It's actually the Enterprise, not Kirk, not Spock. It's the Enterprise that can take on a god, which I thought was like a really, really interesting and powerful metaphor. But even then, they're ambivalent about, right? Because there's a sense again of awe and depth. And I like The Next Generation a lot, but I don't remember ever having that sense in The Next Generation.
I think that's deliberate.
So speak to that, please.
Part of what the Next Generation is doing, because what we're really talking about there. So there's an issue with the Starship Enterprise that if you have warp engines and transporters and holodecks, you have actually sublimed beyond the material plane of reality. There's no reason to be zooming around in chunks of metal, even with force fields. You're far, far beyond this. But the as an intervention into the mythos, there's a vast chunk of our civilization who aren't ready for that. So we discussed this in the last that there's the whole dream of interstellar travel, and it's all about harnessing the machines, and it's really about the continuation of what we are now into the future without any changes. And that audience love Star Trek because it is limited into this scope, unlike something like 2001, which is a transcendent myth. And Star Trek, the original Star Trek, is more in that line. It is more psychedelic. 2001 is psychedelic.
It has that feel at times.
But Star Trek, The Next Generation, really limits that. And that's part of its strong appeal to people who love the space program, people of an engineering mindset. The modernist myth has to be kind of embodied in that way. And in Next Generation, it is it's almost like the bridge is like a corporate boardroom. And you have the captain's boardroom there. So it's also reflecting like the dominant kind of power structure of the age, turning up for work at the corporation. They're very, very different from Star Trek. So I think that's a deliberate act in the storytelling, is that limitation. But I think I'm proposing here that the real value of Star Trek would be in the way that Plato did with the Greek gods, is to add something to it, is to twist the values. We have this pre-existing story that has this incredibly wide reach, and we could add something to it, like a different alignment.
So okay, great. I mean, there's 1,000 things I want to ask, but let's just pick up on that. So you've made this great argument, very good, about Star Trek is so appropriate because of its grasp of the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern. But you also said it now, but it's at a place, that liminal pivot point, where it can do something with it. It has a capacity to reinventio. So say more about that specifically. Like what do you see? Do you see that only largely in potential in the existing shows, or do you see that there's moments where they realize that power and actualized it towards some end? What's your sense there?
Yeah, I think that there are moments like that. Maybe a way into this is to think about like the symbol of the starship,
Right.
because
Yes,
it's a fascinating symbol. It's the Millennium Falcon, it's the Starship Enterprise, so many other occurrences, and we will probably never have a starship, although to many people it seems like a reality. So it's a very religious symbol because it represents in some ways ultimate power. It's the pinnacle of our technological achievements, but it also takes us beyond where we are. It's a chariot of gods in a sense.
Yeah, very much.
And you know, the thing we remember is the starship from all of these things. It lingers as a character, and we even bring it to life with AI. It's given a voice and an ability to commune with us. So I think, in fact, I'm gonna I'll name check Ian M. Banks, who I doubt you're very aware of.
John. I've got one of his books, but I haven't read it yet. So
okay. So Ian M. Banks is very influenced by this history of space opera, Star Trek amongst it, Foundation as well, Asimov's Foundation. And he takes it a step further into like the very far future and a far future civilization called the culture. And the culture are completely utopian because they have artificial intelligences called minds who organize the whole civilization, and the human beings just live for pleasure and fun, and it's a complete post-scarcity society, which Star Trek also nods to. So for fun, the culture, citizens, and the minds intervene in less developed civilizations. Sometimes that goes well, sometimes it goes really badly. So it's kind of a very neoliberal metaphor that there's less developed peoples and we can go and intervene with them. But Ian M. Banks carries it all the way through because he starts talking about the potential for sublimation, to going beyond reality. And I think this is where we're kind of taking our thoughts to now. Star Trek always has this potential for
so that would bring back the numinous that I'm sort of missing in the next generation. Oh, so please continue. That's really powerful.
Well, there's two things. I think through the symbol of the starship, we do return to the numinous, and science fiction is always torn. You have the traditional golden age science fiction, and then there was the new age of like Ursula Le Guin, Samuel Delany, and they always went more into the numinous, actually. But I'm also interested in that kind of Silk Road metaphor. Get to a planet of the aliens. And in Star Trek, we use science. We drill a hole in the Earth's crust. But that's not really the complexity of what we're dealing with. We're not really dealing with geological problems. We're this tremendously complex 8 billion people on a planet. And as you say, what we need is wisdom. I think the thing we add to the Star Trek mythos is stories of wisdom, to bring people into thinking about what is wise.
That's great.
And this is where I think we go metamodern, past the postmodern. You know, what is really the wise thing to do about I'm trying to pick one which isn't too inflammatory, actually, but transgender issues. What is actually the wisdom of this situation? That our traditional stories, our modern, our postmodern, they all have a very conflicted position on this. What's the integral metamodern wise synthesis of this? That would be a brilliant 2-hour Star Trek.
I like this proposal a lot. I think this is a really good proposal. Do you like I say, do you have any inkling that this is on the horizon or possible? I mean, there's the new show, The Strange New World, which is hearkening back to the old series in some way. Do you think that do you think there's an opportunity there, or do you think this is something that the writers haven't heard yet?
I would predict, and maybe this could be a testable prediction, that if we get to a Star Trek that people really love again, it will be doing this. Call it two things: the numinous and wisdom.
Yes.
It will be pushing the narrative into both those spaces, because what the last 10 years have done, like the J.J. Abrams reboots and then particularly Discovery, is they are very postmodern, as I said in the last talk. They're a very aggressive postmodern rewrite of Star Trek. And that was never the right thing to do.
No.
Really make it work. Strange New Worlds is too retro.
Yeah, I think it's too nostalgic.
Too nostalgic. So if Star Trek comes alive again, or if a new version of this myth is given to us, that's probably more likely. It will be this kind of psychedelic journey into the numinous and the expansion of people's understanding of what the wise solution to our problems is.
That's excellent.
Have I won you over to Star Trek?
I think you've made a very good argument for its fundamental principle and its real potential. And then you've made a prediction about whoever can actualize that potential will make Star Trek beloved again. And I think that's very good. I think that's very sharp, very sharp. I like this, Damien, a lot. We're almost out of time, but this was, we came to a nice closure, but I want to give you an opportunity for, any afterthoughts or postscripts or culminating things you might want to say about this.
I was really happy that we're able to think a bit about these kind of developmental theories. I think they're very imperfect, but I feel they're almost like a needed addition to our public discussion, even if they're just an improvement on the kind of really broken left-right political model.
Yes.
If in public terms we could think about, the need to integrate differences and metamodernism. But I guess also in our little corner, as Paul calls it, which I'm really happy to be part of, I think we've been having this discussion about story and the need for story.
Yeah, very much.
What role it plays. So I guess I picked Star Trek to do it with, but I think this is my way of putting forward the argument for the need for traditional and more stories as part of the picture.
I think that's right. I don't know if you caught the video. I think it was released 2 weeks ago that I did with Sean Coyne and his ideas about narrative as well.
Yes.
I think and he and I are going to do one about his take on the Matrix, which is of course just laden with Platonic and Neoplatonic symbolism and imagery, and so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, and and Jonathan and I, we did it with Jordan Peterson as well, and also Jonathan and I and Paul. Lots of discussion about this because, of course, this has to be done with wisdom. Because, as you said earlier, we're drenched in narrative, and that's clearly not. Just having more narrative isn't the answer. And of course, whatever makes you adaptive also makes you prone to self-deception. The narrative bias is one of the most powerful biases to which human beings are subject. And so wielding narrative comes with a tremendous responsibility to cultivate wisdom about it. Plato is a great example of somebody who's wrestling with that. But I like the way this was put forward, the way you argued it, very, very carefully, very discerning. And then I guess there's a bit of I don't know if there was a bit of irony, even dramatic irony in what we were doing, because if we know this, does that make it impossible for us to enter into the coming Star Trek? Because we're we've seen the man behind the curtain. The way you said that as you became a good story writer, you lose the ability to become immersed.
I think there's an extra level of enjoyment in. I talk about this to my podcast audience and why I put so much time and effort into criticism.
Yeah.
Critical thinking about culture, basically, because when you can bring the story up from the mythos and into conscious thought and play with it and then let it sink down again, your enjoyment of the stories is much higher as well from doing that.
And I would put to you that that's exactly the parable of the cave. You rise up to see the sun, but you return back to the depths. Exactly.
I just say,
go ahead,
John, for honoring me with 2 sessions for this. I'm really happy that you did.
The honor was mine. This was, I mean, both of these, I think, are just the overarching argument, I think, is powerful and it's beautiful. And of course, you knew from the beginning that you had a hook into me because I'm a Star Trek devotee. So, thank you so much. I hope maybe that you and I and Sean could at some point have a discussion like this about more philosophical, broad, about narrative per se, that builds on, the videos I've done with you, the videos I did with him. If you're open for that, I'd very much like to set that up at some point in the future.
Absolutely.
Okay. This has been fantastic. It's been so good to just be with you again. I love the taste of your mind. I really like it a lot.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's been great.